Hey, it's Clinton, and I'm going to be walking you through this week's assignment, which is styling the contact form I've created for you in GitHub. So go ahead and clone this project. You can open it in Code Spaces to edit it, or you can clone it to your local personal computer, and you can work on it in whatever editor you choose. I recommend Visual Studio Code. So let's read through the README here. So your task is to beautify this contact form. That means that you really won't have to make any changes to the HTML in it, but you are welcome to do so if you think you can. If there's something you want to change about it and make it look a little better. At a minimum, I want you to add a background to the page. I want you to add a drop shadow or border to the main element, and optionally a background, which I recommend. I want you to style the labels in the form, style the form fields, and style the fields with the invalid pseudo class so that the form elements indicate whether the user has satisfactorily filled out the form or not. Now, you are welcome to go above and beyond this, but this is the minimum. Here's an online tool for generating shadows, and if you choose to use maybe say like a background, like a linear gradient for the background rather than an image, you can use a similar CSS generator on the internet to generate linear gradient CSS code. Now, if you scroll down, there's the rubric. As with all of the performance activities in this class, I try to provide a rubric for this one because I want to be as objective as possible about grading your work. So here is the rubric. You're welcome to read through that. But let's jump into the code here. So I want you to, if you have not done so already, go ahead and install Live Preview in the VS Code extensions so that you can actually look at your work as you make changes, and then open the HTML file, which we won't be making a lot of changes to this, but we do want to open it so we can preview it. So once you've got this open, click the Show Preview icon in the top right corner, and then go ahead and open the CSS file. Now, as you'll see, the form's pretty plain at the moment, but we're about to change that. So let's look through the code. You notice that I've already gone ahead and set the font size in the HTML element so that we can use relative units like rems and ems throughout the rest of the document. And they will, of course, be based on that 16 pixel font size. I've already centered the form in the page for you, so you don't have to touch any of this code right here. And let's get started with the background of the body. So what I want you to do is, I would prefer you use an image, a background image, because we did cover some of those background sizing, repetition, and positioning CSS properties, and I would love for you to practice those. But you are welcome to use a background linear gradient. So you can go to Google or whatever your search engine and search CSS gradient generator, and the first option is going to probably be cssgradient.io, which is the one I recommend. I've already opened that up and configured mine. You're welcome to do the same. Now you'll notice it gives you a preview of the linear gradient here at the top. You can go through and adjust these sliders to set your linear gradient stop points. You can adjust the colors. You're welcome to be as creative as possible. Just make sure I can read your text. And it does offer several nice starting points here, so you can click on one of these and adjust it to your liking. I've already built mine, so I'm going to come down to the bottom, and I'm going to click this Copy to Clipboard button. All right, now right here, I want you to paste whatever code you get. And as I said, I would prefer that you use a background image to practice the stuff we learned in class, but you can use a gradient. And for expediency, that's what I'm going to do in this video. So there's the gradient. We have a cool background. I think we're done with the body element. Let's move on down to main. You'll notice that the text is rather hard to read against the blues. So let's fix that by setting the background of the main element to be white. And if you look at the contact form HTML file, you'll notice that the main element does wrap both the header and the entire form. So that is the one to set the background color to. So we'll do that. And that looks pretty good, right? Now the next thing we want to do is fix the issue of the text being right up against the edge here. So let's go ahead and add a little bit of padding, and 2 rem is what I prefer. It's just right. It looks pretty good, right? Now one thing you notice is the H1 does have a lot of top margin on it. So let's fix that we'll add a nested rule here, and we'll set that margin dash top to be 0. And now the top looks pretty similar to the bottom. We can go ahead and set the padding dash top to 0 as well. And so that should be roughly the same as the bottom here. And then finally, I want to smooth these corners a little bit so it looks a little more welcoming to the user. So let's set the border radius to be about 10 pixels. And then before we finish with this, let's add a shadow to it to make it friendlier to the user. So again, you can go to Google or whatever your search engine is and choose CSS Shadow Generator. And the first option will be this CSS Generator website, which I've already set up. Now, I prefer to center my shadows, but you don't have to do that. It's totally up to you. But if you want to center your shadows, you can set this horizontal and vertical slider to 0, which is the offset of the shadow underneath the element that you're adding it to. And if you set them both to 0, it does center the shadow underneath that element. And then finally, you want to maybe increase the blur a little bit, and add a little more spread to it so it sticks out a little further. And maybe reduce the opacity so it blends with the background a little more. And so then we can copy this top rule. That's the only one you need. These other two are for backwards compatibility, but they're no longer needed today. And then go back to your main element and paste it into that main element so you get a really nice looking shadow under your form. Now moving down, we can get down, we can adjust the form a little bit itself. The only tweak I would recommend making is maybe adding a little more gap between each pair, each form label, form field pair. And so we could add maybe, set that to 3, and you get a really nice gap between each pair. But I think 1.2 is probably good. Now with the form groups, I gave you a couple of options. You can use this vertical columnar layout, or you can use what's called a horizontal form layout. So if you comment out that first section, uncomment the second section, you'll see you get a really nice horizontal form layout, okay? But it's totally up to you. Personally, I prefer the columnar layout. I think it looks better unless you just have to go with the horizontal. Next thing we want to do is we want to fix these form labels. I recommend adding a little padding or margin below them so they're not sitting right on top of their respective form field. And so we can do that. We'll add a little margin bottom, and now you get this nice little bit of white space. Might be a bit much. Let's try maybe a quarter rem. That looks better, I think. And another thing we'll learn next week, but I'm going to go ahead and show you. You can set the font weight to bold. It does make those labels appear a little bit better to the user. Now, with that done, we can move on to the form fields. The first thing you'll notice is the fonts are not all the same. So let's fix that by using this font rule we defined in the HTML tag. But we're going to replace the 16 pixels with 1 rem because that is 16 pixels, right? Remember, 1 rem is exactly whatever the font size is. And the cool thing is now if we ever need to change the font size, we change it in one spot instead of many. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to give the text inside these form fields a little bit of breathing room. So let's set some padding. About a half a rem should do it. That looks really good. And then we'll also round the corners so it matches the rest of the web page, but we'll half it to 5 pixels instead of the 10 that we used on the main element. Now, one thing you'll notice is it does look somewhat 3D, and that is because it's using the standard border that's supplied by the browser, but we'll override that and we'll set the border to be 1 pixel solid and a light gray, which is just CCC. And don't forget that hashtag, right? And so that looks a lot better, a lot better. The next thing I want to do is add a pseudo class selector here, and we're going to nest it. So we're going to use the and sign to say that we are still working on this selector, but we're going to focus that a little bit by using the additional pseudo selector. So we're being more specific, right? And the focus pseudo selector means whenever the user clicks into it, so it has the user's focus, right? And the first thing I want to do is I want to, namely, get rid of this ugly orange outline that the browser applies by default. So what we'll do is we'll set an outline of our own, and we'll say 1 pixel solid, and we'll make it darker, so maybe like a 333. And so you see that looks pretty good, but I think maybe 2 pixels is better. Okay. That looks a lot better, but now we still have that gray border you can see barely inside of it. Let's get rid of that. So we'll say border. We'll set it to, we'll leave it at 1 pixel, and we'll leave it solid, but we want to leave it transparent. And you might be asking, well, Mr. Bush, why did you not just get rid of the border altogether with maybe say 0 or none, just no border? And I will show you why. If I set that to 0, now remember that in the box model, a border does take up space, all right? And so if you count the top border and the bottom border, each 1 pixel, that would be 2 pixels of space vanishing from the vertical stack here. So when I click in it and the border goes to 0, you see that other elements on the page are moving. And we don't like that. That looks really weird when you see stuff moving around in your layout. And that's because those 2 pixels are no longer occupied. So the browser does rearrange stuff to take up that space. Not good, right? So we just leave it 1 pixel, but we make it transparent so it's not visible to the user. And now stuff doesn't move around anymore. And if you remember from the box model, an outline does not take up any space. And so even though we're adding 2 pixels of outline, nothing else moves around. Okay, so that's what we want. Now, one other thing that we need to cover is, if you remember from the rubric, we do need to add that invalid form field state. So let's go ahead and add that. We'll say, and that is the invalid pseudo selector. And again, we want to leave that border transparent, but what we're going to do is we're going to add an outline, kind of like we did with focus, but we're going to make it red. Okay, so make it red. We just use that keyword. And now these things are red until you satisfy the requirement. If you go look at the HTML, each of these fields are marked as required, and that is why they are invalid until we enter some text in them, okay? Pretty cool, right? So we can, as we select things and fill out the fields and, you know, put in the phone number, message, and pick things, they all go happy, okay? And then the last thing we want to do is let's style this button a little bit. The button's quite ugly. And what I'm going to do is I want to copy the exact rule I used on the form fields for the font and make the button have the same font. We'll add a little padding to it. So we'll set 0.5 rem on the top and bottom, 0 on the sides because we don't care about the sides. And we're going to get rid of that border because it just looks ugly. And let's go ahead and round those sides. Again, we'll use 5 pixels. And then let's change the color a little bit, right? So let's go back to our gradient here. And we're going to copy this darker color. We'll copy that. Go to google.com. And I'm going to search color picker, which will bring up Google's built-in color picker. I'm going to paste in that code. So this is the color of our gradient. But I want to lighten it up a little bit, okay? So we're going to lighten it up quite a bit. And that's going to be, well, not that much. Let's start over. All right, so that's where we started. In fact, let me go back and get that color again. Let's see. All right, we'll paste that in there. And we'll lighten it up a little, okay? And then that's going to be the color of our button when we hover over it. So let's do that. We'll say the button's hovered over. We're going to use a much lighter blue. All right. Now, before the button's hovered over, let's grab that color from our gradient again, and we'll just start off with this dark blue for that. So we'll set outside of the hover pseudo selector, so right under that border radius, let's add this background color, and we'll paste in that dark blue, and you'll notice it was hard to read the text, so let's do that. Set the text color to white. All right, so now we got that, and when we hover over it, we get the lighter color. One final tweak is we'll set the cursor to be pointer, which is a little hand, just like you get with hyperlinks. So just another clue to the user that this is something we interact with. And finally, this is something I'll show you next week. We'll set this text transform property to uppercase, so it's all caps. I think that makes it stand out more. Okay. Now, one last thing I want to show you is you'll notice that the form radio buttons their labels are bolded, which I don't like, right? I think this preferred contact method text should be bolded like the rest of these fields, but not the labels to the radio buttons. So let's make this preferred contact method also a label in our HTML. I know I said we weren't going to touch this, but we'll make this one little fix. And now it's bolded like the rest of the stuff. And then up here in the input text area and select, what we're going to do is we're going to say input type equals radio. So this is an attribute selector we're using. And then we're going to use that subsequent selector I showed you. And we're going to say label, okay? And what that means is we're going to match any labels that follow a radio button. And I want to set their font weight to normal. All right, so let's see. Why did that not work? We got input radio. And okay, you know what we need to do is instead of using input radio again, I should have used the nested selector. There we go. So that's saying start with this and any of these that, so the ampersand means this, right? And then match that has the attribute type set to radio, match a label that follows such an element. And you'll notice now the text is normal weight. So it looks much better. And then finally, one other thing I want to do is we want to add a little more space between these. So while we're in this nested CSS rule, we'll say margin dash right, and we'll set that to maybe 2 rem. Maybe that's a little bit much. Let's set it to 1 rem. There we go. So now there's a little more space between each of these. Does that look better? I think so. And with that, that's all we need. You can get rid of this. We moved this button colon hover. That's the same thing as this. So we can get rid of that. Don't need that anymore. Save your work. Make sure that you do commit and push or sync this up to GitHub so that I can grade it. But that is the conclusion of the video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot, and I will see you in class.